Tao Meeting Archives, September 20th, 2015. Straw Dogs by Bill Bunting.
Let's go ahead and do the meeting beginning ritual. 起立，面向佛堂，参下三鞠躬、一鞠躬，再鞠躬，三鞠躬，参下各位顶禅师一鞠躬，开班一鞠躬，请坐下。Please be seated. Okay.
And welcome everybody. Good morning, afternoon, evening, night, wherever you happen to be. It's a beautiful Sunday afternoon in Indianapolis. The sun's out and shining. The leaves are still on the trees. It's not quite as humid and a little cooler than it has been. Autumn is on the way. Yeah. I love to watch the seasons change, although I have to confess that I'm pretty good with about 3 flakes of snow in the winter, and then I'm ready for spring. But, you know, that's living in Indiana. If you don't like the weather, wait for 15 minutes, it'll change. I wanted to talk today a bit about impartiality. And the title of this talk is Straw Dogs. And it may not be readily apparent how those two terms reconcile with each other, but I promise that they do. As I guess I tend to do fairly frequently, I want to start off with a little insight into just basic human nature. And that piece of human nature this time is what happens when a person approaches us. Okay? Whenever somebody approaches us anywhere, we form an initial first impression based on mere seconds of observation of that individual. And there are a tremendous number of things that contribute to that first impression. Some of them we're aware of, many of them we are not. For instance, the way a person smells, the pheromones that they're excreting at any given moment in time have an effect on our initial first impression. Their appearance, their body language, how they present themselves, what they say and what they do, long before we ever have an interaction with them, our brain is formulating an impression of that person. Depending on the circumstances, there may or may not be an initial question of safety. And somewhere close on the heels of the answer to that question is the moral judgment about whether or not this is a good person for us to be interacting with, whether this person intends us harm or not, whether they're trustworthy or not. And all of those things are fabricated within the first 35 to 40 seconds of seeing an individual. Our brain assimilates all of that information and all the information that it can get and renders a value judgment on the impending interaction with another individual. And following all of that assimilation then comes the interaction itself and our response to it. Now, I'm going to talk a lot about impartiality for the next 30 minutes, but I want to preface that discussion with the following disclaimer. I'm not suggesting for a second that anyone compromise their own personal safety, the safety of their family or their children or anyone else for the sake of being compassionate. It is a fundamental tenet of the teachings that we take care of ourselves so that our taking care of others, our giving, can become sustainable. And part of taking care of ourselves is not putting ourselves in situations where our health and safety are at significant risk. And if I don't say this, somebody's going to come along on the back end of this talk and say, well, gee, what about the guy that's trying to rob your house, or the guy who comes up behind you at the bank machine and wants to take your money? Those aren't the interactions I'm talking about, okay? although I suppose to a certain degree or another, they could fall into that category. But once you clearly understand another person's intent, then all you really have is the choice for how you're going to respond to that intent. And if you truly believe that your safety is in jeopardy, for goodness sake, get to some place where your safety is not a question, and then evaluate the interaction. So what happens if the person that approaches us is a vagrant, a homeless person, somebody who's lived on the streets for a while, who's a little unkempt, a little disheveled, a little rough looking? Do we instantaneously write that person off as being a danger to us, or in some way not good enough to warrant an interaction with us? Do we allow our fears and prejudices to get in the way of potentially rendering aid to somebody who might legitimately need it? What if that person's a Middle Easterner in an airport or a bus station somewhere? Do we judge that person more harshly because of his Middle Eastern background? Do we stop to think that maybe he's wearing a bomb vest or wants to hijack the airplane? What if it's somebody that we don't know that's, dressed well, smells good, and looks to all intents to be an honorable and upright person? See, we all make those value judgments, and we make them very quickly. It's one of the things that kept us from being eaten alive by saber-toothed cats early on in our evolution. And we still carry with us the vestiges of the fight or flight response and the rapid summation of what an interaction is going to entail. It's one of the reasons there are still human beings running around on this planet. If we didn't have those traits, chances are, being soft and squishy as we are and lacking claws, teeth, fangs, or other, ready means of defense, we would have been lunch for a whole passel of saber-toothed cats early on in our evolution. Not a pleasant end to Homo sapiens. And yet when we read the Tao Te Ching, we are encouraged to adopt a higher state of mind than perhaps what our initial impressions would lead us to say or do. Chapter 5 of the Tao Te Ching says, "Heaven and earth are impartial. They regard myriad things as straw dogs. The sages are impartial. They regard people as straw dogs. The space between heaven and earth, is it not like a bellows? Empty, yet never exhausted, it moves and produces more. Too many words hasten failure, cannot compare to keeping to the void." For a long time, I always thought that those last two sentences really did not fit too terribly well in this particular chapter. However, after having had several years to reflect on that, and more than a little bit of Derek's excellent education on the matter, I think I've finally come to the point where I understand why those two sentences are there, and we'll get to that in a moment. We've gone over this a couple of times in the past, but just to be sure that everybody understands, we need to know first what a straw dog is, why that reference exists in these ancient texts. A straw dog is an effigy made out of straw or grass that was used in ancient Chinese religious festivals as kind of a sacrifice. And so what happened is that people would make these straw effigies and adorn them and use them in the festival, and then after the festival they were discarded in the street because they were no longer useful. And so it bears asking the question, why would Lao Tzu say that the sage regards people as straw dogs? Well, there's a relatively straightforward answer to that question, and the key to it is impartiality. The first two sentences say that heaven and earth are impartial. They treat the myriad things, all that is, as straw dogs. Okay? That implies a level of detachment, I suppose, but more importantly, it completely eliminates prejudice because the myriad things are not created out of love for them, and they're not destroyed out of hatred for them. The straw dogs in the chapter were effigies not born of love and sharing and commitment. They weren't born as children to the people who made them. They were made to a purpose. And they weren't discarded out of hatred for them or some kind of a dislike. They didn't do anything to engender anger or negative emotions from the people that made them. They simply were no longer useful. And the point to that whole thing is that they were made and discarded impartially, that there was no favoritism shown to one group or the other, no emotional attachment made to them, whether in creation or destruction. They simply, just like the Tao, existed for a period of time. And then when, they were no longer useful, they were discarded. The chapter goes on to say that the sage regards people as straw dogs. That means kind of the same thing, that the sage doesn't care for people out of a particular love for any group of people or a particular disdain for any other group of people, but rather from the same level of caring and compassion for all people. There are other chapters, for instance, the one where Lao Tzu writes, to those who are good to me, I am good to them also. To those who are not good to me, I am also good to them. Right? Where he regards all people as worthy of our compassion and our understanding. Different chapter. Lao Tzu then goes on to write that the space between heaven and earth is like a bellows, always moving, always producing more. I think we can liken that to the individual who has an open mind, a mind that is constantly in motion, constantly producing more, not closed off to any particular set of ideas or any particular group of people. And I think that metaphor fits very nicely for this situation. We know that all things come to us, and even ourselves come from that void. And that we were created without any kind of partiality, just like all the things around us. That the Tao itself doesn't judge. It doesn't have the capacity for moral judgments or judgments of good or evil. Now, I'm going to digress here one more time for a moment and say that that does not mean that good and evil don't exist, or that right and wrong don't exist. Those two, unfortunately, very prevalent concepts are just dead wrong. The fact that the Tao does not judge us doesn't mean that there's not right and wrong or good or evil. There absolutely are. Hence my disclaimer regarding safety requirements, because there are bad people in the world who do bad things to other people. So don't take what I just said to mean that there isn't good and evil or right and wrong. Understand clearly that what it means is that the Tao itself does not pass that moral judgment upon us. Our own karma takes care of that judgment. Further, An open mind acts like a bellows by garnering experience and education, by observing what's going on, just by the very process of living. We can gain all sorts of education and knowledge from education, and that knowledge is good and beneficial to a point. But living, experiencing life, experiencing these interactions is what gives us wisdom. Knowledge is not necessarily synonymous with wisdom. It's a good basis for where to start. But experience is by far the better teacher. And as we gain that wisdom should lead us to a more compassionate stance and a more impartial judgment of our fellow man. The last two lines of the chapter, too many words hasten failure, cannot compare to keeping to the void. If you take a moment to think, another one of my commonalities, we all know somebody who just can never seem to stop talking, no matter what the topic is, whether they know and understand it or not. An individual with that attitude can't learn anything. It's like the teacup that's already full. And while there's never an absence of words, there's usually an absence of understanding. Too much learning, too much talking, too much academia, all of that excess can fill the mind with knowledge, but it lacks experience. It can't fill the heart with wisdom. And while all of that knowledge is good for a basis in action and practice, it's no substitute for living. Wisdom is the gift of living, the gift of experience. That's why old people like me say, gee, I wished I'd have known when I was a kid what I know now. There's some knowledge and wisdom that can only be gained by going through life and getting knocked down a few times. And heaven knows I've been there. But I can look back on some of those lessons these days with a bit of humor, because they all help to bring me to where I am now. And I kind of like where that is. So what does it mean to keep to the void? It means to maintain an open heart and an open mind. It means to regard all the people around you with impartiality, without judgment, without categorizing them as good or bad or worthy or unworthy or anything else. That's not anywhere near as easy to do as it sounds, because of how our physiology is wired and how we've been taught all of our lives to view and interact with other people. I don't know about all of you guys when you were little kids, but when I was a little kid, my parents always told me don't talk to strangers. Because talking to strangers was dangerous. I don't recall knowing a single child who was ever snatched off the street when I was a little kid, but I imagine it happened then just like it happens now. And the advice to not talk to strangers was my parents' best efforts at keeping me safe. That philosophy, though, doesn't always necessarily prepare children for some of the oddities of modern life. You know, when I was a kid, believe it or not, there were not large multi-store shopping malls yet. At least not around here. And so the scenario of a kid being lost in a mall and having to figure out where to go ask for some help just never entered the minds of any of the adults around me at the time, because that just wasn't something that happened. But there were lots of other things that happened to kids when I was little, where knowing to go seek out help might have been beneficial knowledge to have, and yet all of our parents just told us not to talk to strangers. From that earliest understanding on, we're typically taught that strange is uncomfortable, that the people that we don't know may not be safe, that they may seek to do us harm in some way. And I suppose there is some small risk of that occurring, but I think most of the time, the potential harm that might befall us is an illusion of our own mind and not necessarily the intent of the person approaching us. Now, the other side of that coin is that I'm really not the sort of person that people want to pick on too terribly often. And so I don't have a lot of experience with being picked on. I don't ever consider myself to be in an unsafe situation. Haven't for years and years and years. But I still think that perception is largely an illusion of our upbringing as children and our perception of the intents and hearts of other people. And I think we are admonished by Lao Tzu, starting in chapter 5 and going on through the Tao Te Ching, to see people in a different light, without making the moral judgment, without understanding the intent. To become like the sage and regard all people with the same level of caring and compassion, no matter what they look like at the moment. Once again, unless they're directly trying to hurt you, in which case go someplace safe. I think perhaps by adopting that more open mind and open heart, that we may find that most people really don't intend to do us harm. They're simply just other souls on the path trying to find their way to the same place we're all going, to enlightenment someday. Not everybody you run into is going to understand that path initially. But with the right example, maybe we can plant a seed that helps them get there one day. So to kind of wrap this one up this morning, Lao Tzu says, and it's the truth, that to the Tao, we're all straw dogs. We're not born out of love from the Tao, and our lives don't end because the Tao hates us. The Tao simply is. It doesn't impose a judgment upon us at all, or upon anything else. It simply exists. And so to say that the sage views the people as straw dogs implies that same level of impartiality. It's not an uncaring, uncompassionate, detached sort of an impartiality, but rather it's a leveling of the field. It's a consistent level of compassion and caring for all people, irregardless of their particular position in life or situation. So if we can metaphorically regard others as straw dogs, perhaps with that impartiality and without the moral judgment, then we can begin to more closely emulate the life of the sage. And really importantly, that impartiality is not cold, uncaring detachment, but rather a consistent level of compassion and caring for all people, viewing all people as worthy of being cared for, compassionate with and of giving some kind of service to. Thank you all awful much for letting me share with you this morning. I hope something I said was helpful to someone. Thank you.
Bill, thank you so much. Very timely talk, especially about the impartiality, because one of the trending topics in the recent past, has to do with the prevalent American attitude toward the issue of immigration reforms, and so forth. I was looking up. I was looking up this topic, and I saw a comedy bit from Bill Maher about this, and he's like, yes, we have a crisis. Immigrants coming into our country, taking away our jobs, and I'm paraphrasing Bill Maher here, and he's like, that's right. I'm talking about the Australians. Look how many of them are coming over, becoming bartenders, and taking away our acting jobs. So many actors and actresses are from Australia. It's not even funny. So, and the point that, and he's like, yes, I'm going to build a wall. I cannot, unfortunately, build a wall over the ocean, but I'll build a reef, a barrier reef, to prevent them from swimming over here from Australia. So great bit. Definitely something that you can look up on YouTube if you haven't seen it, and it points out some of the cultural hypocrisy that we do have, treating people differently based on their appearance, based on external superficial factors, when in fact the Tao teaches us to look beyond that and look to the essence. So let's go ahead and do our meeting ending ritual for today. Everyone, please follow me. 起立，面向佛堂，持下三鞠躬，一鞠躬，再鞠躬，三鞠躬，持下多一点的是一鞠躬，接班一鞠躬。Well done, everyone. Thank you so much.
Join the Tao Meeting Live to participate in the questions and commentary. For more information, go to http://taoism.net/tao/connect-online.